Welcome to your first lecture on Chapter 1 of your course textbook by Hauer and Young. In this short discussion, we'll look at a few general points about the Bible. We'll look at the canonization process of the TANAK and the New Testament. We'll look at the history of the translation of the Bible into English, and then we'll conclude with some points about the contemporary lens in the study of the Bible. One of your discussion question asks, why study the Bible? Certainly there'll be a diversity of responses, but they all kind of fall within the categories of because it's fundamental to one's identity as a believer or non-believer, or because it still has impact in everyday life, in culture, in politics, in art, music, and so on. Just listening to the news, you can think about a variety of different ways it still impacts society today, and so it is relevant. The approach that your textbook authors Hauer and Young use in their book looks at and uses three lenses or three worlds to look at the Bible. And these are the literary world, the historical world, and the contemporary world. The literary world is concerned about the Bible as literature primarily and the different literary devices and facets that can be found there. The second, the historical world, asks questions like who wrote the text? When was it written? To whom was it written? And why was it written? And then ultimately the contemporary world, and that's each and every one of our lenses that we bring to the interpretation of the text. The word Bible comes from the Greek word biblia, which means books. Now originally, ancients would not have thought of books as we know it today, which are a number of pages bound together by a spine. Instead, they would have thought of a book as a scroll, so one long piece of papyrus or animal hide that had at both ends a pole in which it was rolled in upon itself. The Bible is a collection of diverse pieces of literature that were collected by and for the Jewish and Christian communities. And the key word there is diverse. We want to remember that the Bible was written by a number of different authors throughout a number of different places and times. So when we think of the Bible, one apt way of understanding it is as if it were a library. The Jewish Bible is composed of 24 books divided into three sections. The three sections called the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Altogether, the Jewish Bible is referred to as the Tanakh, which takes the first letter of each section, the T for Torah, the N for Nevi'im, or the prophets, and the K for Ketuvim, the writings. The Old Testament is what Christians call the first half of the Christian Bible. Now, for some biblical scholars, the term Old Testament is problematic, and so they try to get around it by calling it the Jewish Scriptures or the First Testament, mainly because the word old has pejorative meanings or negative connotations. But really, the Old refers to the Old Covenant that Christians believe, and the New Covenant in Jesus is what we find in the New Testament. Among Christians, there is some agreement about what's in the Old Testament. Some churches, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and a few Protestant groups add 6 or 7 additional books with several additions to others. These are called the apocryphal works, or better, the Deuterocanon, which we'll look at later on. The Christian community added 27 writings to the Old Testament, and that's what becomes known as the New Testament. There are 3 dimensions to the historical world. The first is the literary history, and that looks at how the text came into existence. The second is the textual history, and that reconstructs the most authentic text in the original language from copies and from translations. Now, those of you who speak a second language know how difficult it is to translate a phrase from one language to another. Now, the added difficulty for scriptural texts is that that same phrase is different in other papyruses. So, for example, papyrus number 1 could use the word church, papyrus number 2 could use the word community, and papyrus number 3 could also use the word church. So, a textual critic would look and see and compare and say, I think the authentic word here is church, because many of the papyruses or manuscripts that are out there use the text. The third dimension is the historical context, and there we construct the historical context out of which the text emerged. This is, of course, the realm of anthropologists and archaeologists and sociologists that aim to seek what the society was like at the time of the writing of that particular text in the Bible. That gives us an interesting snapshot out of which we can understand the text itself. Canonization is the process by which a set of books came to be viewed as having sacred authority. Now, some of you might come from a tradition where canonization often applies to the making of saints. And here it's no different. At one point, our Christian ancestors determined whether or not a particular writing or scripture was intended to be forever. It's standardized or made into part of the canon. Canon, another word for canon, is a rule or a standard. The canonization of the Tanakh had three phases. The first, the Torah, was canonized in the context of the Babylonian exile, which ended in 538 BCE. We'll look at that, what happened during the Babylonian exile briefly later on in the course. But for now, think about the Babylonian exile as being one of those pivotal moments in Jewish history that changed everything. Kind of like September the 11th for us moderns. Everything changed before and after September the 11th, and how the world viewed itself. The second phase, the Nevi'im, was canonized in the 2nd century BCE. And then finally, the Ketuvim, the writings, was canonized after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The destruction of the temple stands as another one of those central bits of history for the Jewish people and also for the early Christians. And so these are pivotal moments in which the Jewish community had to solidify and stop and consider what was sacred for them, and that was embodied in the canonization of the Tanakh. As early as the 3rd century BCE, there was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint. Now the story goes, in Alexandria there was a Greek ruler called Ptolemy who had a great library in his city called Alexandria. And in his library he was missing the Jewish Bible. And so he had commissioned 70 elders to translate from Hebrew to Greek the Jewish Bible. And the story goes that they were all sent off, and when they came back, they had miraculously interpreted it exactly the same. And so what we have in the Septuagint, named after those 70 elders, is the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And this is significant because the early Christian community would have known Greek, would have been the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean at the time, would have perhaps not necessarily had access to it, but would have had bits and pieces of it. The canonization of the New Testament was a long and gradual process. It began with a writing of the sayings of Jesus and stories about him, and gradually those writings were collected and adapted and completed between 70 and 100 CE. So if you can imagine, these collected and adapted works being written 50 or 60 years after the death of Jesus. By 100 CE, 7 out of the 13 letters attributed to Paul had been gathered and collected and achieved authority. By 200 CE, the 4 Gospels and the 13 letters attributed to Paul and other works were likely authoritative for many Christian communities. So for 200 years, we didn't have a New Testament per se that was bound, standardized. It was fluid and dynamic, and it was in the process of being standardized. I'll certainly have more to say in the class about this topic. In general, as mentioned, canonization was gradual and controversial. Even today, some books are drawn more upon than others. And you can think about how your minister or priest or pastor will preach on a few particular books rather than, the entire canon of the Bible. Or certainly you might have more favorite books than other books in the Bible. And so in a way, we say that those books that are referred to more have more authority than the ones that aren't. And in a way, we can say that canonization is a continual process even today. The history of the translation of the Bible into English is a very interesting history. It begins with John Wycliffe, who completed a translation into English in 1382. He worked with the official Catholic translation of the Bible, which was written entirely in Latin. It was called the Vulgate. And this was banned by the church and state. Why was it banned? Because it was understood that the Bible was only meant to be interpreted, understood by clerics and priests, not by the common person. It was understood that its message was far too complicated for common folk and peasants. The next English translation was completed by William Tyndale in the 1530s. What was different was that he worked with the original language, Hebrew and Greek, rather than the Latin, which was a later language. This too was banned by church and state, but it received some civil support. So by this point we have in the European mainland the emergence of the Reform movement, and here we have the English Reform movement, and this gets embodied in the people's desire to have access to a Bible in their language. The Coverdale Bible was completed in 1539. Miles Coverdale worked with previous English translation as well as Latin and German translations. Now, again, those of you who speak second languages can appreciate that sometimes when you translate something from one language to another language to another language, the meaning can be lost. And so we can see that this translation may not be that authentic to the original language. Now, Coverdale's Bible was created with the blessing of Henry VIII, certainly the founder of Anglicanism, one of the proponents in the final split between the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church. However, access to this Bible was limited only to the aristocracy. Again, this whole idea of limiting access to only those who were educated persists even under the reign of Henry VIII. Next, we have the Douay-Rheims Bible. It's named after the place in northern France in which some Catholics were exiled from England to. It was completed in the early 1600s, and it worked with a Latin Vulgate. It was officially sanctioned for use in Catholic churches. In 1611, we have the King James Bible. Here, scholars used the Tyndale and Coverdale translations and translated it into a very highly polished English style, with these and thous that we normally associate with Elizabethan writing. This was created under the blessing of James I, who was concerned about a very fractious country, divided based on religion. And so he saw this Bible as a way of uniting his kingdom. Completed in the late 1800s is the Authorized Revised Version, and an American version was created in 1909. Here we find interdenominational scholars working using the King James Version itself. This was yet another interdenominational, inter-Christian effort to unite the different Christian denominations in using a similar or the same Bible. But note how they use the King James Version as their starting point for translation. Even with the New Revised Standard Version, if you go to the bookstore, you'll notice a variety of different translations. Why? These come out of different motivations. Some new manuscripts have been discovered, and so scholars will go back to those sources and try to retranslate them to find the more authentic interpretation. As well, you'll find a desire to understand the text in a more contemporary setting. You may pick up a Bible that has a lot of very contemporary language, idioms that are used, and so on. Why? Because those who want to understand the text find that having the language much more meaningful makes the message of the Bible more meaningful. And so, for instance, you have a Bible called, in fact, The Message, which is a highly paraphrased form or translation of the English Bible. As well, you might find some Bibles are much more concerned about the word-for-word literalness of the Bible. And you can find that in what's called an interlinear Bible. In class, we'll compare some of these side by side so that you can see why it is that there is that difference and what that difference looks like. And then finally, there are different translations because there are differences in theology. Some denominations like to stress certain things, while others like to downplay them, and so on. And so that will also affect how a Bible gets translated. Here we have a spectrum of the different types of Bible translations. On one side of the spectrum, we have a word-for-word translation. Now again, those of you second language speakers know that sometimes things can't be or shouldn't be translated word for word, otherwise the meaning is lost. And then on the other side, because of that concern, we have a paraphrase. So we take basically the spirit of what's being said there and interpret it in a meaningful, sensible way for today. And so it may go far across the field in terms of it. In the middle, we have a thought for thought. And here we have basically that, which is the idea and in the intention of what is written in that original text is aimed at being preserved in the translation. Again, I invite you to compare these. Go online, go to BibleGateway.com and see how one particular verse or chapter is translated in all those different translations of the Bible. I think doing so is useful to help us to see the possible ranges of meanings. And finally, the contemporary world, or the contemporary lens. And these are the lenses through which each and every one of us interprets Scripture, whether we're male or female, or for a particular ethnicity or culture, background, socioeconomic class, small town, big town, whatever the case might be, wherever we find whatever our context is, that is the lens through which we interpret the Bible ourselves. Another point that Howard and Young are concerned about is the notion of truth. They differentiate between these two types of truths. A referential truth, and that's something that can be empirically or scientifically verified. And the other is symbolic truth. And this doesn't depend on it actually having happened, but focuses on what light it can shed on the meaning of life. Now you can certainly agree or disagree with these two different definitions. For some of you, they may be one and the same. For others, this is food for thought. At the end of chapter 1, Howard and Young offer us a challenge, and that is to set aside, or at least be aware of, our own questions, concerns, and preconceptions shaped by our experience of the contemporary world long enough to travel into the world of the text itself, and into the historical world in which the text came into being and through which it has passed. In other words, they're inviting us to suspend our interpretations and enter into the world of the text, to think about, who was the author, who was the audience, what are the intentions of the author, how would the original audience have heard it, what are some of the historical events that would have colored the telling of the story, and so on. Ultimately, Howard and Young will argue that the three-world approach is not a tool, not an end in itself, rather a unified reading of the Bible which blends a literary, historical, and the contemporary lens is the best way of approaching the Bible. I leave that for you to decide.